Germany, 1945. Winter light sliced through the barracks windows of Stalag Luft 3, cold and sharp as broken glass. 23 American airmen sat at wooden tables, staring at plates of grilled beef, real beef, thick as a man's palm, steam rising into the frozen air. The guards stood watching, confused, as grown men wept over meat. They couldn't understand. The Americans weren't crying from hunger. They were crying because, for the first time in months, someone had remembered they were human. The story begins 6 months earlier, in summer skies above Bavaria. August 1944. Captain James Donovan's B-17 caught fire at 18,000 feet. The flak burst came without warning. A black flower blooming beneath the bomber's belly, metal tearing like paper, engine number 3 erupting in orange flame. The aircraft shuddered. Smoke filled the cockpit, thick and chemical, burning his throat. Through the windscreen, Bavaria spread below like a green quilt stitched with rivers. Impossibly peaceful, impossibly far. "Bail out," his voice cracked over the intercom. 10 men jumped. 10 white flowers opened against blue sky, drifting down through summer air while the bomber spun toward Earth, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud. Donovan pulled his ripcord at 12,000 feet. The parachute jerked him skyward, or so it felt, the sudden deceleration after freefall creating the illusion of rising. Silence replaced engine roar. He hung there, swaying, watching his crew scattered across the sky like dandelion seeds. The ground rushed up. He hit a wheat field, the stalks golden and dry, crackling beneath him as he rolled. Pain shot through his ankle. For a moment he lay still, listening to his own breathing, feeling the earth solid beneath his back. Then voices, German voices, sharp commands cutting through the afternoon heat. Within an hour, all 10 crew members stood in a village square, hands behind their heads, surrounded by Wehrmacht soldiers and curious civilians. An old woman spat at Donovan's feet. A child stared, wide-eyed, at his flight suit. The soldiers, young men mostly, their faces worn by 4 years of war, remained professional, almost bored. They had seen this before. The sky rained Americans all summer. "Terror fliegers," one soldier muttered. "Terror flyers." Donovan said nothing. His ankle throbbed. The sun beat down on his head. He thought of his mother in Pennsylvania, how she would receive the telegram, missing in action. He wondered if she would guess the truth, that he was alive, that he had survived the fall. Most families never knew. They were loaded onto a truck. The ride lasted 3 hours, winding through countryside that looked nothing like the hell he had imagined. Villages with intact churches, fields being harvested, women hanging laundry. War existed here, certainly. He saw it in the hollow faces, the patched clothing, the absence of young men. But not the apocalypse. Not yet. The interrogation center sat outside Frankfurt, a sprawling complex of concrete buildings and wire fences. Dulag Luft, transit camp for captured airmen. Here they would be processed, questioned, sorted. Here the Luftwaffe would try to extract information about targets, tactics, squadron numbers. Here terror flyers became prisoners of war. Donovan spent 2 weeks in solitary. A cell barely wider than his shoulders with a narrow bed and a single window set too high to see through. The heating cycled between extremes, furnace hot, then freezing, then hot again. Sleep became impossible. Time dissolved. Guards brought watery soup twice daily, bread hard as wood. The interrogator visited on the 3rd day. Hauptmann Richter spoke perfect English, his accent vaguely British, acquired during university years before the war. He sat across from Donovan in a comfortable office, offering cigarettes, asking casual questions about home. "Where did you grow up? What did your father do? Did you play baseball?" The questions seemed innocent, but Donovan had been briefed. Every word was a trap. "Name, rank, serial number," he repeated. "That's all I'm required to give." Richter smiled, tired. "Captain Donovan, we already know everything about the 390th Bomb Group. We know you flew from Framlingham. We know your squadron commander's name, your aircraft identification number, even what you ate for breakfast the morning you were shot down. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside, detailed intelligence reports, accurate down to the color of the 390th's insignia. Donovan felt something cold settle in his stomach. They did know. Everything. So, you see, Richter continued, lighting his own cigarette. I'm not asking for military secrets. I'm simply establishing your identity, so we can process your transfer. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You'll receive Red Cross parcels. You'll write letters home. He paused. Or you can continue this silence, and we'll assume you're a spy. Spies have no Geneva protections. It wasn't a threat exactly, just a statement of fact delivered in that same tired voice. Donovan studied the German officer's face, lines around the eyes, gray at the temples, the exhausted posture of a man who had conducted this same conversation 1,000 times. 4 years of war had worn them all down. He confirmed his identity, nothing more. The transfer came on September 2nd. Donovan and 40 other American airmen were loaded onto a train, packed into boxcars marked with POW insignia to prevent Allied strafing. The journey took 2 days, rolling north through a Germany that surprised him with its ordinariness. Towns still standing, people going about their lives. He had dropped bombs on this country for months, watching from 6 miles up as cities burned. From here, pressed against the boxcar slats, peering through gaps in the wood, he saw only fields and forests and the occasional station platform where German civilians waited for regular trains, barely glancing at the prisoners. At night, the train stopped in a rail yard. Guards allowed them out to relieve themselves beside the tracks. Donovan stood in the darkness, ankles still aching, surrounded by men who had become his new squadron, not by choice, but by circumstance. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? They had fallen from the sky. Now they would wait out the war behind wire. The train moved on. The camp sprawled across Silesian pine forest, 60 miles southeast of Berlin. 5 compounds surrounded by double wire fences, guard towers every 100 yards, searchlights that turned night into day. Stalag Luft III housed 10,000 Allied airmen, mostly British and American, officers and sergeants who had once controlled machines capable of leveling cities, now reduced to counting days in wooden barracks. Donovan's compound held 2,000 Americans. The senior officer, Colonel Blake, shot down in 1943, a veteran of this peculiar existence, greeted new arrivals with practiced efficiency. "Forget escape," Blake said bluntly. "The Brits tried last March. 50 men got out through a tunnel. The Gestapo shot 50 of them. The Germans don't play games anymore." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your job now is to survive. Follow the rules, attend roll call, don't antagonize the guards. We're at war, gentlemen, but we're also guests of the Luftwaffe. They treat us correctly, we respond in kind." The compound operated like a small city. Men organized themselves into combines, groups of 12 sharing Red Cross parcels, cooking together, supporting each other. They held classes in mathematics, languages, engineering. They put on theatrical productions in the camp theater. They published a newspaper. They played softball in the summer, ice hockey in winter. They created a civilization inside the wire. But they were hungry. The German ration was barely adequate. Black bread, potato soup, occasional barley. Red Cross parcels supplemented this. Cans of meat, chocolate, powdered milk, cigarettes. But parcels were irregular. Sometimes they came weekly, sometimes not for months. By autumn 1944, as Allied bombing intensified and German infrastructure crumbled, the parcels stopped almost entirely. The men grew thin, not starving, not like concentration camp prisoners, not like Russian POWs who died by thousands in German captivity, but chronically, persistently hungry. The kind of hunger that becomes background noise, always present, dulling thought and energy. They talked endlessly about food, recipes, restaurants, Thanksgiving dinners. The conversations were both torture and comfort, keeping alive the memory of abundance. Donovan's combine included Lieutenant Carl Weber, a tail gunner from Wisconsin, Sergeant Mike Torres, a navigator from New Mexico, Captain Henry Walsh, a pilot from Virginia, and 8 others all shot down that same summer, all trying to understand this new existence. They heated water on improvised stoves made from tin cans. They traded cigarettes for extra bread. They learned which guards could be bribed, which were sympathetic, which were dangerous. The senior guard in their barracks was Feldwebel Kraus, a man in his 50s too old for combat. His face deeply lined from 4 years of watching young men waste away behind wire. He was correct, never cruel, maintaining professional distance. But sometimes, during evening roll call, Donovan caught him staring at the prisoners with an expression that might have been regret. Winter came early that year. By November, snow covered the compound. The barracks, designed for summer, became iceboxes. Men slept in all their clothes, huddled together for warmth, breath visible in the frozen air. Morning roll call, appel, became an ordeal. Standing in formation for hours while guards counted and recounted, toes going numb in inadequate boots, fingers burning with cold. The hunger worsened, German rations decreased. No Red Cross parcels arrived in November, none in December. Christmas approached with grim inevitability. The men tried to maintain morale. They decorated the barracks with paper ornaments. They rehearsed carols. The camp chaplain, Captain Miller, held services every Sunday, his sermons focusing on endurance, faith, the promise of liberation. But liberation felt distant. The war ground on. They heard rumors of Allied advances, France liberated, Belgium freed, but Silesia remained deep inside German territory, unreachable. On Christmas Eve, the compound received an unexpected gift. The German commandant, apparently moved by some vestige of holiday spirit, authorized a special meal, potato soup with actual pieces of meat. Not much, a few chunks per man, dark and stringy, but real meat, the first in months. Donovan ate slowly, making each bite last. The meat was probably horse. It didn't matter. The taste, the texture, the protein. His body responded with almost painful gratitude. Around him, men ate in silence, some crying quietly, ashamed of their tears but unable to stop them. Carl Weber whispered, "My mom makes pot roast every Christmas. Roast beef with carrots and potatoes, gravy thick as pudding." His voice cracked. "I'd give anything for one bite." Donovan said nothing. What could he say? They all had their food memories, their private torments. His was his grandmother's kitchen in summer, the smell of apple pie cooling on the windowsill, crust golden and flaking, ice cream melting into hot fruit. That kitchen felt like another universe now, impossibly distant, perhaps imaginary. The chaplain led them in singing Silent Night. The German guards, standing outside the barracks, joined in. For a few minutes the war paused. Then it resumed. January 1945 brought news from the east. The Russian offensive had begun. Soviet armies were driving toward Germany, fast and unstoppable, crushing everything before them. The sound of artillery could be heard at night, distant thunder growing closer. The guards grew nervous. Rumors spread through the compound. Evacuation, forced marches, summary executions. No one knew what would happen when the Russians arrived. On January 27th, the evacuation order came. 10,000 men were roused at midnight, given 1 hour to pack whatever they could carry. They marched out into a blizzard. Columns of prisoners stretching for miles, guarded by Wehrmacht soldiers who looked as terrified as the POWs. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero. Snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring the road ahead. They walked west, away from the advancing Russians, deeper into a Germany now collapsing under the weight of total war. Villages they passed through showed increasing desperation. Women and children fleeing with handcarts, old men digging defensive positions, everything breaking down. The guards pushed them onward 20 miles a day, sleeping in barns or open fields, eating snow to quench thirst. Men died on that march, the sick, the injured, those who couldn't keep pace. Donovan watched Lieutenant Palmer, a bombardier from Ohio, sick with dysentery, collapse in a snowdrift. The guards stopped briefly, checked for a pulse, kept moving. They couldn't afford delays. The Russian tanks were coming. Donovan's ankle, never properly healed, screamed with every step. He leaned on Carl Weber, who leaned on him. They became each other's crutches, shuffling forward through the snow, motivated by nothing except the animal instinct to continue existing. After 12 days, they reached a railway junction. Boxcars waited. The prisoners were loaded aboard, 60 men per car, packed so tightly no one could sit. The train moved slowly, stopping frequently, waiting for refugee trains, ammunition trains, troop trains. The German railways were dying, clogged with the debris of retreat. Inside the boxcar, men stood pressed together, sharing body heat, breathing each other's air. The smell was terrible. Some men fainted from exhaustion. Others prayed. Donovan stared through a gap in the boards, watching Germany slide past, burning towns, columns of refugees, destroyed tanks rusting beside the road. The train stopped finally at a siding outside a small camp. Stalag 7A, Moosburg. The camp was chaos. Designed for 10,000 prisoners, it now held over 100,000. Americans, British, French, Russians, Italians. Every nationality Germany had captured. Barracks built for 100 men housed 500. There was no sanitation, no medical care, barely any food. Men lay dying in the mud. The guards, overwhelmed and exhausted, had largely given up trying to maintain order. Donovan's group was assigned to a barracks in the American sector. They found space on the floor, lying shoulder to shoulder, too tired even to complain. That first night, Donovan slept 14 hours straight, his body finally surrendering to accumulated exhaustion. When he woke, reality reasserted itself. They were starving. The German ration at Moosburg was a bowl of watery soup once per day, sometimes a piece of bread. No Red Cross parcels, no supplements, just slow starvation. Men began dying, not dramatically, but quietly, slipping away in the night, their bodies finally giving up. The dead were carried to the camp cemetery each morning, a grim procession that became routine. Donovan watched his own body waste away, ribs prominent, legs stick-thin, face hollow. He weighed maybe 120 pounds now, down from his pre-flight 170. Looking around the barracks, he saw corpses walking, skeletons in rags, eyes sunken and empty. The mental fog was worse than the physical hunger. Thoughts became sluggish. Time blurred. Days passed without distinction. He spent hours lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, too tired to move. Sometimes Carl Weber would shake him, force him to walk around the compound, keep the blood moving. Sometimes he did the same for Carl. They kept each other alive through sheer stubbornness. March arrived. The sound of artillery grew louder, coming now from both east and west. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable armies. Liberation was coming. But would it come in time? In the barracks, men made bargains with God. They promised everything: sobriety, fidelity, devotion, in exchange for survival. They talked about what they would eat when they got home. The conversations became increasingly fantastical. Steaks, mountains of steaks, burgers, fries, milkshakes, pie. The American abundance they had taken for granted now seemed like myth, something from a fairy tale. "First thing I'm doing," Carl said one night, his voice barely above a whisper, "is going to Joe's Steakhouse in Milwaukee. Biggest ribeye they got. Baked potato with butter, sour cream, the works. Apple pie for dessert." He closed his eyes. "I can taste it. Can you taste it?" Donovan could. That was the torture. His mind, starving for stimulation, could produce the phantom taste of beef, perfectly grilled, juicy, and tender. It was more vivid than dreams, and more painful. Then, in late March, something unexpected happened. Feldwebel Kraus appeared at their barracks one morning, accompanied by 2 other guards. He looked uncomfortable. The prisoners, recognizing him from Stalag Luft 3, gathered around cautiously. Kraus had always been correct, but this was unusual. "I have announcement," he said in broken English. "Tomorrow is Easter Sunday. The commandant has authorized special meal. There will be meat." The barracks fell silent. Meat. The word hung in the air like a promise too good to be true. What kind of meat? Someone asked. Kraus hesitated. Beef. Real beef. Not much, but real. He paused, seeming to struggle with something. Also, the Commandant wishes you to know. The war will end soon. We know this. We have lost. He wants you to remember Germany showed you respect. We followed Geneva Convention. The message was clear. The Germans knew liberation was coming. They knew they would be judged for their treatment of prisoners. This meal was both gesture of humanity and insurance policy. Look, they could say later, we treated them well. We gave them meat at Easter. But in that moment, the politics didn't matter. Only the meat mattered. That night, the barracks buzzed with conversation. Men who had been silent for weeks found energy to speculate, to hope. How much meat? How would they cook it? Would there be other food? The anticipation was almost painful, reawakening hunger that had dulled into numbness. Donovan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Part of him refused to believe it. Too many promises had been broken, too many hopes crushed. He had learned not to trust anything until it materialized. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive through all of this, allowed itself to hope. April 1st, 1945. The sky over Moosburg hung gray and heavy, threatening rain. Morning roll call proceeded as usual, the endless counting, the exhausted standing. But today something felt different. The guards seemed nervous, urgent. The Commandant himself appeared, a rare occurrence, speaking briefly with the senior Allied officers. At noon, the order came. All American POWs were to report to the mess area in groups of 200. Donovan's barracks went together. They shuffled across the compound, moving slowly, conserving energy. Other prisoners watched from windows, British and French and Russian faces tracking them with dull curiosity. Everyone knew something unusual was happening. The mess area consisted of long wooden tables under a canvas awning. German cooks worked over field kitchens, smoke rising into the gray sky. The smell hit first. Meat cooking, fat sizzling, the aroma so powerful after months of deprivation that several men actually stopped walking, overcome. They filed to the tables. Guards handed out plates, real plates, not the usual tin bowls. And on each plate, a piece of grilled beef, maybe 4 ounces, maybe 5, not large, but unmistakably real meat, charred on the outside, pink in the middle, still hot. Donovan stared at his plate. The steak looked back at him, impossible, miraculous. Around him, 200 men stood frozen, holding their plates, unable to process what they were seeing. Carl Weber started crying. Not quiet tears, but great wrenching sobs that shook his skeletal frame. Within seconds, others joined him. Grown men, warriors who had flown through flak, who had survived crashes and interrogations and death marches, stood weeping over pieces of beef. The German guards watched, confused. They had expected gratitude, perhaps relief. But this emotional breakdown bewildered them. One guard, young, maybe 19, turned to Feldwebel Kraus. Warum weinen Sie? Why are they crying? Kraus said nothing. He stood with his hands behind his back, watching, his worn face unreadable. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he didn't. But he didn't interfere. Donovan lowered himself onto a bench. His hands trembled as he cut into the steak with a dull knife. The meat parted easily, juices running onto the plate. He lifted the first piece to his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue. Salt, fat, protein, life. His body responded immediately, almost violently. Saliva flooded his mouth. His stomach cramped with sudden recognition of real food. He chewed slowly, forcing himself not to rush, knowing his shrunken stomach couldn't handle too much at once. But it wasn't the taste that made him cry. It was the memory. Sitting at his family's table in Pennsylvania, his father carving Sunday roast, his mother passing potatoes, his sister complaining about homework, the ordinary magic of normal life, of abundance taken for granted, of a world where steak was just dinner, not a miracle. It was the reminder that such a world still existed somewhere, that this hell, the camps, the hunger, the dying, was temporary, an aberration, that on the other side of this nightmare, life continued. People ate meals together. They complained about trivial things. They were bored, comfortable, safe. He had forgotten. They all had. Survival mode required forgetting what normal felt like, because remembering was too painful. But the steak brought it all back. Not just the memory of food, but the memory of being human, of belonging to a civilization that valued something beyond mere survival. The Germans couldn't understand. How could they? They had been at war for 6 years. Their cities were ash. Their sons were dead. They had forgotten too, in different ways. But they had never lost everything the way these prisoners had lost everything. They had never been reduced to animals, then suddenly reminded they were men. Donovan ate slowly, methodically, making each bite last. Around him, the crying gradually subsided into silence. 200 men sat eating steak on Easter morning 1945, in a prisoner of war camp in southern Germany, while the world ended outside the wire. When he finished, he sat for a long time, staring at the empty plate. His stomach felt strange. Full, actually full, for the first time in months. The sensation was almost uncomfortable. Carl Weber sat beside him, wiping his face with his sleeve. "That was real," he said quietly. "That actually happened." "Yeah," Donovan replied. "It did." They filed back to the barracks in silence. Behind them, the next group of 200 was already lining up for their turn. The German cooks kept working, grilling steak after steak, feeding thousands of starving men this one meal, this one gesture of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. 3 weeks later, American tanks rolled into Moosburg. The liberation happened fast, almost anticlimactic. German guards surrendered without resistance. The gates opened. Allied soldiers poured in, shocked at what they found: living skeletons, mass graves, conditions worse than they had imagined. Medical teams set up immediately, triaging the worst cases, distributing food carefully to prevent refeeding syndrome. Donovan and his barracks mates were processed quickly, names recorded, medical checks conducted, transportation arranged. Within days, they were flown to recovery camps in France, then shipped home to America. He arrived in New York on May 15th, 2 weeks after Germany's surrender. His mother met him at the pier. She didn't recognize him at first. This gaunt, gray-haired man who moved like an old person, wearing an army uniform 3 sizes too large. Then she did, and she ran to him, and they stood holding each other while other families reunited around them. The next weeks passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, psychiatric evaluations. The doctors said he needed to gain 50 pounds. The psychiatrist said he needed to talk about his experiences. He did neither. He ate mechanically, without appetite. He spoke only when necessary, giving minimal responses. He couldn't explain what he felt. Not to doctors, not to family, not to himself. He had survived. That should be enough. But it wasn't. Something essential had been taken from him in those camps. Something beyond weight and health. The ability to trust, perhaps. The ability to believe in permanence. He flinched at loud noises. He hoarded food. He woke every morning at dawn, instinctively preparing for roll call. In June, his mother made pot roast for Sunday dinner. The kind of meal he had dreamed about in the camps. Beef and potatoes and carrots in rich gravy. The family gathered around the table, everyone trying too hard to act normal, to not stare at him, to pretend everything was fine. His father carved the roast. Steam rose from the meat. The smell filled the dining room. And Donovan started crying. Not quiet tears. Great wrenching sobs, exactly like in the camp, but worse because now he was home. Now he was safe. Now nothing justified breaking down like this. His family stared, horrified, helpless. His mother reached for him. He pulled away, stumbling from the table, locking himself in the bathroom. He stood at the sink, staring at his reflection. The face looking back was his, but older, harder, marked by things no face should have to remember. He gripped the porcelain, breathing hard, trying to understand what was happening to him. It wasn't the meat. He understood that now. The meat was just a trigger, a symbol. What destroyed him, both in the German camp and here in his Pennsylvania home, was the whiplash between worlds. The impossible juxtaposition of starvation and abundance, suffering and comfort, death and life. In the camps, he had survived by forgetting, by reducing himself to pure present tense, no past, no future, just the eternal now of survival. But steak, both times, had forced him to remember, to recognize the gulf between what had been done to him and what human beings deserved, to understand that he had been reduced to something less than human, and that no amount of liberation could erase that reduction. The Germans who gave them steak hadn't understood. They thought it was about hunger, about gratitude, about proving they had followed the Geneva Convention. They couldn't comprehend that the gift was also a cruelty, a reminder of everything that had been stolen, everything that could never be restored. Because even now, sitting at his family's table with all the pot roast he could eat, Donovan was still hungry, not for food, for something else, something that couldn't be grilled or carved or served on a plate, something that the camps had taken and no meal could return. Captain James Donovan lived to be 87. He married, raised 3 children, worked as an aerospace engineer, lived an outwardly normal life, but he never spoke about the camps. Not to his wife, not to his children, not even to other veterans. Only once near the end of his life did he mention the Easter steak. His grandson was interviewing him for a school project about World War II. The boy asked what he remembered most about being a prisoner. Donovan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They gave us steak once, right before the war ended. It was the kindest and cruelest thing anyone ever did to me." The boy didn't understand. Donovan tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could they? How do you make someone who has never been truly hungry understand what food means when you're starving? How do you make someone who has never lost their humanity understand what it feels like to have it briefly returned, only to realize how much was taken? In the end, he just said, "It reminded us we were still alive, and being alive hurt." Feldwebel Kraus survived the war as well. He was never tried for war crimes. He had committed none. He returned to his village in Bavaria, worked as a postman, rarely spoke about his time as a guard. But once interviewed by a local historian in the 1980s, he was asked about Stalag Luft III and Moosburg. "I saw many things in the war," he said, "but the thing I remember most is Easter 1945. We gave the Americans steak, real beef. Not much, but real. And they cried." He paused. "We thought they were crying from hunger, but I think now they were crying for different reasons. We had taken something from them that meat could not restore." The historian asked what he meant. Kraus shook his head. "I don't know, but I saw it in their faces. We gave them food, but we couldn't give them back what really mattered." The camps are gone now. Stalag Luft III is a memorial park with plaques explaining the history. Moosburg is residential housing, ordinary homes where families live ordinary lives. The barracks were demolished decades ago. Only photographs remain, black and white images of men who look like ghosts, standing behind wire that no longer exists. But in those photographs, if you look closely, you can see it. In the hollow eyes and gaunt faces, in the way they stand as if conserving energy, in the expression of men who have learned to survive by forgetting what it means to live. The camps are gone, but what they did to people remains, passed down through silence and tears and inexplicable reactions to everyday things like Sunday dinner. The steak was real, the tears were real, the kindness was real, and so was the cruelty. Both can exist simultaneously. That's what war does. It takes human gestures and twists them into something painful and complicated, and impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't there. Those men ate steak on Easter morning 1945 in a German prison camp. They cried. The guards couldn't understand why. Now you know. And knowing changes nothing, but it's all we can do. Remember that these things happened, that human beings did this to other human beings, that kindness and cruelty can live in the same meal, and that some wounds no feast can heal. The war ended 80 years ago. The men are dead. But the tears remain, frozen in memory, falling forever over a piece of beef that meant everything and nothing, that was both salvation and damnation, that reminded starving men they were still human enough to cry.